What if I told you the most powerful thing a super empath can do isn't loving harder, but walking away in silence, not to punish, not to manipulate, but to finally protect their peace? Because the moment an empath stops chasing breadcrumbs and chooses themselves over confusion, the avoidant's entire game falls apart. This isn't weakness, this is the strongest move of all. If you've ever felt emotionally starved while loving someone who keeps pulling away, this message is your wake-up call. Empaths are known for their deep emotional sensitivity, their ability to feel what others feel, and their natural desire to heal, fix, and support. But when a super empath encounters someone with avoidant attachment tendencies, someone who fears emotional closeness, who pushes love away the moment it feels too real, things can quickly become complicated. What starts as a beautiful, emotionally rich connection often turns into a one-sided emotional labor camp. The empath gives more, leans in, tries harder, while the avoidant leans back, withdraws, and guards their space. This dynamic can trap the empath in an exhausting loop, believing that their love can heal the avoidant, that their patience will eventually be rewarded, or that if they just do everything right, the avoidant will finally feel safe enough to love them fully. But here's the truth. A super empath's real power is not in their ability to sacrifice or endlessly give. Their power lies in self-awareness. The moment the empath starts asking, why am I always the one accommodating? Why do I feel drained instead of nourished in this relationship? Is the moment the dynamic begins to shift. It's not about becoming heartless or suddenly cutting people off. It's about waking up to the reality that their emotional labor isn't leading to connection. It's being exploited. The empath, in their raw desire to connect, may overlook the fact that their needs, their voice, their feelings have been consistently minimized. They may excuse the avoidance inconsistency as trauma, as fear, as a past wound that just needs more of their patience, and that's what keeps them stuck. Self-awareness disrupts this illusion. When the super empath recognizes that love doesn't require self-erasure, they start to see the patterns for what they are. Manipulation cloaked in silence, affection dangled like a reward, connection offered, then snatched away. The avoidant may not be consciously manipulative in a malicious way. They may be acting out of fear, discomfort, or emotional immaturity. But to the empath on the receiving end, the impact is the same. They're being drained, used, and emotionally toyed with, all while blaming themselves for not being enough to fix it. The super empath begins to see this when they turn the focus inward. They start asking better questions. What do I need to feel safe and loved? Why am I settling for this push-pull chaos? Why am I investing in someone who doesn't show up with the same emotional intention? These questions begin a powerful unraveling because once the empath starts valuing their own emotional needs as much as they valued the avoidance comfort, they can no longer justify staying in a dynamic that costs them their peace. This awareness doesn't turn them cold, it turns them clear. They don't suddenly stop caring, they just stop over-functioning. They stop chasing, stop explaining, stop bending themselves into emotional shapes to soothe someone else's discomfort with closeness. And as they pull back that energy and reinvest it into themselves, something remarkable happens. They regain their emotional balance. They see that love isn't meant to feel like a constant test. That connection isn't real if it only exists on the avoidance terms. That their empathy isn't a tool for or others to misuse. It's a gift, and they get to choose who receives it. The transformation happens gradually. The empath who once waited for texts, who analyzed every cold response, who blamed them, begins to detach, not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. They start to observe the avoidance behavior not as personal rejection, but as a reflection of that person's internal struggle. And more importantly, they stop trying to fix it. They no longer believe that their love has to be a healing force for someone who hasn't even taken the first step to heal themselves. That's the turning point, when the empath realizes that love isn't about proving themselves to someone emotionally unavailable. It's about mutual respect, safety, and presence. When the super empath is grounded in self-awareness, they become immune to the emotional games that once kept them hooked. They stop interpreting silence as a mystery to solve or withdrawal as a challenge to overcome. They no longer see the avoidance coldness as an opportunity to prove their worth, but as a red flag that says, this person cannot meet me where I am. And instead of chasing, they choose to step away. Not as a tactic to make the avoidant chase them back, but because they truly understand they deserve more. That shift is monumental. It reclaims their energy, it heals their nervous system, it creates space for real intimacy with people who don't make them question their worth. And ironically, it's often this act, this refusal to engage in the avoidance dynamic, that exposes the dysfunction in the relationship. The avoidant may panic, sensing the loss of control. They may attempt to re-engage, offering breadcrumbs once again. But the super empath who's truly self-aware won't bite, because they've finally seen the truth. Emotional manipulation, even if subtle or unconscious, is not love. It's not care. And it's certainly not something they'll settle for anymore. This self-awareness is what ends the cycle. It's what empowers the empath to make new choices. It's what draws a boundary, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And most importantly, it's what restores their sense of identity, because the empath never lost their light. They just needed to realize they were giving it to someone who wasn't willing to see it. And once they see themselves clearly, no manipulative pattern can survive. Avoidant partners are often masterful at creating a sense of connection and closeness, just enough to keep someone emotionally invested, only to pull away the moment things feel too intimate. This pattern of giving small, inconsistent bits of affection, often referred to as emotional breadcrumbs, is confusing and destabilizing for someone deeply invested in the relationship, especially a super empath. For a while, the empath might see these small moments of connection as signs of hope. A kind message, a spontaneous compliment, a vulnerable moment. These glimpses of closeness feel like proof that the avoidant does care, that love is there, even if it's buried under layers of fear. But here's the truth. These breadcrumbs are not real nourishment. They are fragments, strategically or unconsciously delivered to keep the other person in a state of craving, never quite full, never fully abandoned, but never truly seen either. For the empath, who is driven by depth, emotional honesty, and a sincere desire to connect, this intermittent reinforcement becomes a trap. They begin to tie their worth to the rare moments the avoidant shows up emotionally. They overanalyze every positive gesture, thinking, maybe this time it's changing, maybe they're finally opening up. But the cycle always repeats: closeness, retreat, confusion, and longing. Ending this cycle requires a powerful act of clarity. The super empath who breaks free no longer sees the breadcrumbs as hope. They see them as manipulation. They realize that consistency is the cornerstone of emotional safety, and anything less than that is not love. It's control. And this shift starts when the empath stops chasing. Chasing is not always physical, it's emotional. It's the internal spinning, wondering why the message hasn't come through, replaying every conversation for hidden meaning, justifying hurtful behavior as just their way, or waiting days, weeks, or even longer for the avoidant to re-engage. When the empath stops chasing these emotional highs and lows, they regain power. This act doesn't come from coldness or detachment, but from a refusal to keep themselves emotionally malnourished. They begin to understand that a healthy relationship doesn't require constant effort to decode someone's intentions. It doesn't involve clinging to rare moments of warmth while enduring long stretches of cold. Real intimacy is built on reliability, on mutual effort, on a shared emotional vocabulary, not on mixed signals and long silences broken by fleeting moments of affection. This clarity often comes after the empath has exhausted themselves trying to make it work, after they've given chance after chance, after they've rationalized the distance as trauma or wounds that just need time. And while compassion remains, the empath no longer sees it as their responsibility to carry the weight of the relationship alone. They begin to see how much they've sacrificed, how many of their needs they've silenced, how much emotional labor they've taken on, how often they've put themselves last just to keep the connection alive. Refusing to chase the breadcrumbs is not about proving a point to the avoidant. It's not a tactic or a manipulation of its own. It's a deep shift in values. The super empath begins to value emotional integrity over potential. They value consistency over chemistry. They want someone who chooses them, not just in fleeting moments of vulnerability, but in the everyday moments where real relationships are built. The empath finally realizes that love isn't measured by how much they're willing to endure, but by how much mutual respect, safety, and effort exists in the space between them and their partner. When the avoidant starts to feel the empath pull away, when the game no longer works, when the usual crumbs are no longer accepted, they may react. This is often the moment when the avoidant reaches out again, not because they're ready to change, but because they sense a loss of control. And this is a critical test for the empath. In the past, they might have taken this outreach as a turning point. This time, they see it for what it is, another breadcrumb, and this time, they don't take the bait. The decision to stop chasing isn't made in anger, it's made in strength. The empath has finally learned that their emotional energy is sacred, that they deserve a relationship that feels calm, grounded, and mutual, not one that keeps them anxious, confused, and hoping for change. They recognize that being vulnerable doesn't mean tolerating inconsistency, that loving deeply doesn't mean loving without boundaries. They no longer confuse chaos with passion or withdrawal with mystery. They've come to understand that real love feels safe, not uncertain. This is where emotional self-respect becomes the guiding principle. The super empath begins to redirect the energy they once poured into decoding the avoidance behavior back into themselves. They invest in their own joy, their own healing, and their own peace. They stop overextending themselves to win someone else's comfort. They no longer need to prove they're good enough to be loved consistently. They know they are. And with that knowing, they stop accepting anything less. What makes this transformation so powerful is that it doesn't require a confrontation. It doesn't rely on convincing the avoidant to change or explaining how they've hurt them. It's a quiet internal decision. I am no longer available for relationships that require me to abandon myself. That decision breaks the cycle. It shifts the dynamic permanently. The empath doesn't just leave the relationship, they leave the pattern. And in doing so, they create space for relationships that are truly reciprocal. This new clarity also changes how the empath views love going forward. They stop mistaking emotional unavailability for complexity. They stop being drawn to the idea of fixing someone. They begin to seek, and more importantly, accept partners who meet them where they are emotionally, partners who don't make them question their worth, who don't withdraw at the first sign of intimacy, who don't keep them on edge. They embrace the truth that they don't need to be tested, chased, or manipulated to prove their value. By refusing to chase emotional breadcrumbs, the super empath finally breaks the spell of the avoidance manipulation. Not with drama, not with revenge, but with a calm, grounded sense of self-worth that says, I deserve more than this, and I am not afraid to walk away to find it. Walking away from someone you deeply love, especially when you're a super empath, is one of the hardest decisions you'll ever make. But what most people don't see is that for the empath, walking away isn't driven by anger or punishment, it's driven by clarity. After giving everything, after bending, explaining, hoping, and forgiving, there comes a point when the empath recognizes the truth. Their love alone isn't enough to make someone change, show up, or be present, especially not someone with avoidant tendencies who treats intimacy like a threat instead of a gift. In relationships with avoidant partners, there's a recurring dynamic. The more the empath leans in, the more the avoidant leans out. The more the empath gives, the more the avoidant withholds. And so the empath tries harder, reaching, proving, accommodating, desperately trying to crack the code of the other person's coldness. But with every effort, their emotional reserves are depleted. They start to feel invisible. And eventually they begin to recognize a painful truth. The avoidant isn't just emotionally unavailable. You're emotionally manipulative. Whether consciously or not, the avoidant controls the emotional tone of the relationship. They decide when closeness is allowed, when silence is imposed, when connection is offered. It's a slow erosion of the empath's emotional security. But here's the quiet turning point. The empath starts to realize they've been fighting for a version of the relationship that doesn't exist. They've been loving the potential, the glimpses, the what could be moments rather than the reality. And that realization is painful. It often comes during a moment of stillness when there's no drama, no big argument, just an undeniable sense of emptiness. It's the moment they realize they're not being loved in the way they love and it's not going to change. And so they walk away. Now, to the avoidant, this act can feel sudden, even shocking, because they're used to the empath staying. They're used to being forgiven, to the empath coming back no matter how much space they took or how inconsistent they were. But this time, something is different. The empath doesn't leave in a storm. There's no yelling or accusations. They simply stop engaging in the cycle. They stop responding to breadcrumbs. They stop trying to be understood. They leave with dignity and calm. And that's what makes it so powerful. This kind of departure is not about revenge. It's not a manipulation tactic. It's a profound act of self-love. The empath has finally chosen themselves. And in doing so, they reclaim everything they gave away: time, energy, emotional presence, and most importantly, their sense of worth. They no longer need the avoidant to change in order for them to be okay. They've disconnected their self-esteem from the outcome of the relationship. That's a major shift. For the avoidant, this act can be incredibly destabilizing. They were used to being chased, emotionally pursued, axed out of their shell. But when the empath walks away with peace and resolve, it removes the power dynamic. The emotional currency the avoidant once held no longer has value. The games stop working. The distance no longer draws the empath closer. The silence no longer provokes a reaction. There's nothing left to manipulate because the empath is no longer participating. And here's where the strength of the empath truly shines, because walking away is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new one. It's the beginning of a life where they no longer confuse love with struggle. A life where their empathy is no longer a tool for being used, but a gift that they give only to those who can receive it with respect. This is where they reclaim their peace. Not the peace that comes from getting the avoidant to change, but the peace that comes from no longer needing them to. One of the most misunderstood things about super empaths is the belief that they are weak or overly sensitive, but it takes immense strength to care as deeply as they do and still be able to walk away when something no longer serves them. It takes courage to say, I love you, but I love me more. And that's exactly what happens in this moment. The empath doesn't deny their love. They simply decide that love, in the absence of respect, consistency, and mutual effort, is not enough. And while the avoidant may come back, sensing the shift, trying to re-establish control with new breadcrumbs or declarations, the empath isn't moved. They've learned that real change doesn't come from promises or brief improvements. It comes from sustained action, vulnerability, and willingness. And unless the avoidant is willing to meet them fully, emotionally, and consistently, there is no space left for them. The door isn't left open, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. The empath also begins to reflect on the emotional cost of staying. They realize how many parts of themselves they had to suppress just to keep the peace. How many times they ignored their intuition, dismissed their needs, and settled for a far action of the love they deserved. That awareness becomes a boundary, not a wall that keeps people out, but a filter that ensures only those capable of real connection are let in. In walking away, the empath also models something powerful for others, that it's not just okay to leave a manipulative or unbalanced relationship, it's necessary, that you don't need permission to protect your peace, that staying in something just because of history, chemistry, or the hope of change isn't loyalty, it's self-abandonment, and that true love doesn't feel like a battlefield, it feels like home. What makes this journey so profound is that the empath doesn't become bitter or closed off. They become wiser. They learn to hold on to their sensitivity while also holding boundaries. They learn to give, but not at the expense of themselves. They learn to recognize red flags early and trust their inner voice rather than silencing it in the name of love. They rise from the experience not broken, but rebuilt, stronger, clearer, and more rooted in their worth than ever before. And that's why the act of walking away is the super empath's final, most powerful move. Because it's not just about ending the relationship, it's about ending the pattern. It's about choosing self-respect over emotional chaos. It's about stepping into a version of themselves that no longer needs to prove their value through suffering. And it's about making space for the kind of love they always deserved. The kind that meets them fully, without manipulation, without fear, and without having to fight for basic emotional needs.